And this is Ms. Bernadette Rogoff. This is my good friend. She sits about 3 feet behind me at my desk. So I get to learn from her all day long. She is definitely a fountain of knowledge. I will tell you that. She knows everything about quilts through to artillery. You could just ask her anything, I'm telling you. So without further ado, please welcome Bernadette Rogoff. She's going to present the Allen House Tavern, A Remarkable History.
Thank you, Dana. Okay,
Welcome.
let's get going. So, welcome to the Sign of the Blue Ball, the Allen House and its remarkable history. This house has been at the intersection of today's Sycamore Avenue and Route 35 or Broad Street for over 300 years. I think it's exactly 315 years this year. It's a little rough around the edges. I'm sure we'll get questions at the end about that. But we should all look so good after 300 years. And this house is absolutely jam-packed with history. I made up a kind of a sign that I think Josiah Halstead would be very proud of. So that's what we think the blue ball sign might have looked like. Almost everybody I asked knows the red house on the corner of Route 35 and Sycamore Avenue. And what's really interesting is that it isn't just the only part of history at this intersection, because this intersection was probably a path that may date back to 10,000 years ago, possibly even more. This path brought Lenape tribal members pretty much east-west from the interior of what would one day become the state of New Jersey to the Jersey Shore seasonally to grow crops and harvest fish and dig clams and oysters and generally enjoy the bounty of the coastline, and then move back towards the interior when the colder months came. And so it's really fascinating to me every time I drive 537, I think about that because that's the general route that they would have taken. And so when the first European settlers came to this area, to the Shrewsbury area, they actually called this ready-made road the Indian Path. It wasn't until towards the end of the 18th century that it was formally called the Burlington Path. In 1670, a gentleman named Judah Allen, who was a Quaker, received a grant. He was a patentee and received several hundred acres in the Shrewsbury area. And he built a house roughly where the Allen House stands today. We don't know where the original house stood, and we don't know what it looked like, but it may have looked something similar to the house in the top right corner. That's a house in Virginia, but many late 17th and early 18th century houses were actually quite small. And so it may have looked something like this. We know there was a house here because Judah Allen shows up frequently in the Shrewsbury Friends meeting records. He was very active in the worship congregation, and the house itself is mentioned as the site of a wedding at which Judah Allen was one of the witnesses. So we know that there was a wedding there. Judah Allen died in around 1689 or so, and the property eventually was purchased by a gentleman named Richard Stillwell. And Richard bought it sometime after 1700. He apparently took down the original structure, Judah Allen's house, and built his own, and he used it as a summer residence because he and his big family, he had went through two wives and didn't have any children with the first wife. So his second wife, Mercy Stillwell, had 8 children, and they lived on Dock Street, which was very convenient because Stillwell was a very busy merchant, very active. And so being on Dock Street would put you right in the center of the hustle and bustle of the New York docks and wharves and all the ships coming in and out with all the goods. And he was also one of the founders of the New York Presbyterian Church in Manhattan. And he was also what I would consider an aggressive businessman because he brought lawsuits at least 10 times between 1720 and 1737. As I said, he married twice, and so his family would come to Shrewsbury in the summertime, get out of the city and away from the bad air, and enjoy the shore air. This is when the earliest part of the Allen House dates from. We had a historic structures report done several years ago, and we had wood testing, dendrochronology. And some of the earliest beams are on the northeast corner of the house where the staircase is. And the staircase beams themselves were tested, and these date from 1710. What's also interesting is that the ground floor, the general layout, closely resembles Britton Cottage, which still stands and is owned and maintained by historic Richmond Town in Staten Island. And this is a picture of Britton Cottage, nicely decorated for Christmas with the pretty wreaths. And even though it doesn't look pretty much anything like the Allen house now, this is probably what Stillwell's home looked like on the corner of Sycamore Avenue, which was Burlington Path, and the King's Highway, which is Route 35 now. So that's kind of interesting to think about. That's what it might have looked like if you had gone back in time and walked by it at that point. So Stillwell owns the house, and what's also interesting is that his aunt, Anne, was married to Nathaniel Britton on Staten Island, who owned this house. So Richard Stillwell would have visited them and been familiar with the layout of the house. So that's an interesting connection, I think. Stillwell dies in 1743, and his wife Mercy died 3 years after that. And then his adult children put the house on the market, and they advertised it for sale in 1752 and 1753. And so now we meet the next in our cast of owners, Josiah Halstead. He was born in 1719 in Orange County, New York, right on the banks of the Hudson. And I came from Westchester County, so that's a beautiful, beautiful area there with the Hudson River. And when he was just a baby, his father, Timothy, who was a carpenter, moved the family to Monmouth County. And we're not quite sure why. Monmouth County was a little bit more hustle and bustle than Orange County was back then. And so Josiah grew up in Shrewsbury and learned the trade of carpentry from his dad and worked as a carpenter for a number of years. In 1740, he married Zilpha West, and Zilpha's father, Webley, had a farm on the southwest corner of the intersection, the historic Four Corners, which is where the municipal lot is right now with the police station and the historical society there in Shrewsbury. So he was well aware of the Stillwell house. And so in 1740, he marries Zilpha, and they have 6 children. Josiah only ever had one boy, and that was Timothy, who died at the age of 7 months, and he was buried across the street at Christ Church Cemetery. And 1754 was a big year for Halstead. Two major things happened. He decided to change careers, and so he and Zilpha purchased the old Stillwell place and completely transformed it. They raised the roof, they added a story, they enlarged the kitchen and added another beehive oven and made it just perfect for a tavern. And 1754 was also the year that Zilpha died. And we're not quite sure why. She may have died in childbirth or after childbirth because of complications. So we're not quite sure why, but Halstead decided to name his brand new business the Blue Ball Tavern. If there's one question I could ask this man, it would be that. What inspired him? It's very possible that it was just simply a name that occurred to him to be attractive, a good advertisement. Anybody who's familiar with or who has heard tavern names realizes that a lot of them are very creative. And this all stems from a lot of the tavern names, for example, in dating back to medieval times in Great Britain. There are all kinds of fascinating names that, unless you understand the terms, you're not quite sure why they're called that. There's one particular tavern called the Beetle and Wedge. And upon first hearing, you think to yourself, well, why is a tavern named after a bug? Until you understand that a beetle and wedge are actually carpentry tools. So that's kind of interesting. So again, why Josiah chose the blue ball, we don't know. I would bet cash money that he probably designed and made and painted the sign himself, being a carpenter. And it was also a good way to advertise because it was a fun name, a good name to advertise, short, sweet, and to the point. And so people referred to it as the Blue Ball Tavern, believe it or not, decades even after Halstead died. So his name stuck to the building. A lot of times we think of taverns as being the center of stagecoach travel, but Halstead really relied on local traffic. His tavern, the Blue Ball Tavern, really wasn't connected to a major stagecoach route until much later, way past his time. So his customers were all the farmers coming from inland Monmouth to the docks and wharves, bringing their produce and livestock and farm produce, loading them onto the sloops and getting them up to the big New York City markets for sale. So he had a lot of local patrons, and he was virtually an immediate success. The first year his tavern was in business, his excise tax was the highest in the area. And you had to pay an excise tax if you were a tavern keeper. That was one of the laws governing tavern running. And it was based on your income. So clearly Halstead was doing very well right from the start. We don't know at all what the tavern actually looked like. Anybody who's visited the tavern has visited Allen House. You've seen the bar recreation, but that's a complete fantasy. We really don't know what or if Halstead had a traditional bar. The bar that's in the Allen House right now is actually based on an example in Westchester County at Van Cortlandt Manor. Here are some examples of bars. It was typically sort of like a counter, and then you could display your liquor and your bottles and so on. And it was also a way to secure your valuable stores of liquor. Quite often it would have gates or shutters or something that could be closed when you weren't open, and it would keep your inventory safe. And we absolutely love this view. This is in our collection, and it measures about 12 by 16 inches. It's pen and ink, watercolor wash, and graphite. And it's the earliest known depiction of the tavern. And we think this was done around 1800 or so. So even though it was after Halstead's time, it still gives a pretty accurate depiction of what the Four Corners must have looked like during his occupancy as the tavern keeper. So you see the Allen House all the way over on the left, and then the low one-story building sort of in the center front. That's the West Farm. That's the West Farmhouse. And the artist tried his best to make it look like the Four Corners. It's a panoramic view. But if you didn't know any better, you would think it was just a straight roadway. There on the right is Christ Church. And between Christ Church and Webley West's farm are buildings tucked behind the trees. And that's a depiction of the Quaker Meeting House. So it's really fun, and he's also included a lot of beautiful detail, some wagons, some pedestrians. But the image of the Allen House was absolutely instrumental in the 1970s when the house underwent major restoration. And it continues to be a big help to us, particularly with the big restoration project coming up later this year for the outside. So we're really going to be relying on this and just looking at it with a magnifying glass. And so this was a really major intersection. Everybody knew about it. This was a place where everybody came. The Allen House there on the top left, Quaker Meeting House, Christ Episcopal Church, and Webley West's farm. And so it's really interesting to know that this intersection was just as busy 250 years ago, almost as it was today. Although I don't know how many times a wagon might have driven past the Allen house and driven into the fence, which happens quite often. Halstead was successful, but he also chose a business that was one of the most highly regulated in colonial America. There was not too much wiggle room. Everything was regulated. You were told how much you could charge for drinks and what type of drinks, and what you could charge for stabling, what you could charge for overnight accommodations. There were laws and ordinances guiding tavern business in all of the colonies. And while that was good because travelers then could kind of depend on regular service regardless of where they were traveling, it also made it quite a challenge for tavern keepers because there was, as I said, there was not much room for um, creativity or for charging. You were pretty much strictly bound by what you could charge for your goods. So here's a description of the better sort of American taverns. Excellent dinners are provided. They're talking about 3 meals of the day: breakfast, the midday meal, and then a meal in the evening. Again, we have no idea what Halstead served, but because his tavern was local and relied on local business, we don't think that he provided quite this level of sophistication. This description is more for one of the big city taverns in Philadelphia or New York or something like that. Halstead probably provided 1 meal of the day, and probably all relied on local produce. And it's even possible that he served hard cider made down the road a piece on the Burlington Path, bought from Laird's. We're not sure. We do know that he got a lot of his rum and other liquor supplies from the big New York City liquor dealers. But his tavern wasn't just a place to go and drink. Halstead himself must have been the type of man who was able to be very gregarious, very friendly. I have a feeling people really liked him. Um, this is a very interesting image. It's kind of poking fun at a rowdy tavern. People are pulling each other's wigs off. There's someone in almost like a work cap. People are smoking. They're falling off their chairs. So taverns were pretty rowdy. We also don't know how rowdy Halstead's tavern was. But Halstead was able to get the circuit court to meet there. Going into Freehold to the courthouse to have a case heard was quite often a hardship for people to get out there. So the circuit court did just that. It literally made a route around the county, and almanacs would publish exactly where it was going to show up. And Halstead was able to arrange to have it meet at his tavern so he could charge the court money for occupying one of the buildings, one of the rooms. He could charge for meals, he could charge for accommodations. So that was a great extra income stream. He had political gatherings there, he had entertainment. He also had the Shrewsbury Library Company meeting there. That was a group that he was one of the founding members of, and it was a sort of a subscription library. It was also sort of an informal post office. You could actually send letters and packages to Halstead's Tavern, and he could keep them for people to come pick up. And Halstead was also very involved in the local community and local politics and government. And one of the things he did was to become an overseer of the poor. And this was an unpaid position, but it was something that you were um, sort of voted in, and it was usually 2 men of Shrewsbury. And your job was to keep track of all the indigent, all the poor people, orphans, unwed mothers, uh, elderly who could no longer take care of themselves, handicapped individuals. And your job was to find homes for them. And local residents would technically bid on keeping somebody who was poverty stricken. And for a fee, they would receive a stipend. And out of that stipend, they were required to provide room and board and comfort for the individual who was lodged with them. Um, it wasn't an easy job. The quote here from John Brinley, he was one of the overseers of the poor of 1770. And we have amazing records from the Shrewsbury Poor Book. And this lists everything from the 1730s right on through to almost 1800. And the list of all the individuals and their trials and tribulations and how the overseers of the poor more or less tried to do their best. But John Brinley had a really difficult time because you also had to keep track of all the money, the taxes that would come in. For example, this is where Josiah Halstead's excise tax was coming in. And so out of that excise tax, the overseers of the poor were funding the keeping of the poor. So John Brinley writes that the sum raised was but £100 exclusive of fines and excise, which I leave to my succeeding brethren, wishing them better success than your undertaking than I have had. He tried his best, but he did not enjoy it at all. And this was John Brinley himself actually wrote this in the town book. So it was kind of a fascinating glimpse into the fact that this was nothing but a headache. So Halstead started out well, but things gradually started going downhill. Uh, Economic events far beyond his reach began to erode all his original success. And that burden was squarely on top of the Parliament of Great Britain. All the taxation that they were putting onto the colonies, the Stamp Act and the Intolerable Act, and taxing everything from glass to paper, everything affected Halstead and every other tavern keeper directly. So you have liquor. Well, what is your liquor coming in? Glass bottles. You're offering almanacs for your customers and newspapers for your customers. Every printed item was taxed. Playing cards were taxed. People would come to taverns expecting to be able to play cards. With all of this taxation that was eating away at Halstead's income. And one of the other difficulties was that Great Britain deliberately kept the colonies cash poor. And so it was fine, for example, if Halstead wanted to barter maybe one of his livestock or something that he was growing in one of his orchards. He also had orchards attached to his tavern property. And that was fine to trade locally. But New York City rum merchants are not going to take chickens for bottles of rum. They want hard cash. And Halstead, more and more, had less and less money. So why do we know so little about Halstead? I mean, he was a businessman. Where are all his records? Where did everything go? You are looking at a copy of the single document we know of, written in Josiah's own handwriting. And we will come to why most likely this is the only thing that's left. And this was not in any papers of Josiah Halstead's. This found its way into the papers of Joseph Holmes, whose papers we have in our own library and archives. Holmes was a merchant and businessman. He lived in Shrewsbury, and he and Josiah Halstead apparently knew each other quite well. I believe they were both members of Christ Church as well. And so at 5 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday on May 21st, 1762, Halstead writes, I send you by James Mount £30 cash, please, to pay for the run you bought for me. And I shall take it as a favor if you can send one more, for I am now out of rum and cannot come this week, but hope soon to be there and conclude with my best respects to you and your family from your most humble servant, Josiah Halstead. P.S. Sunday morning, 5 o'clock, and no more paper in the house. So there's kind of an air of desperation here. He's already sent £30 for rum that Holmes had purchased for him. Holmes went back and forth to New York much more often than Halstead did, apparently. And so Halstead, at least several times, relied on Holmes to bring back rum and other supplies to him. And so he's also saying, well, here, I'm paying you for what you got for me last time. Can you please pick some more up for me? Because I'm not going to be able to do it myself. And I promise I'll pay you. So you can sense the desperation. He's short of cash and he's also short of paper. And so he was apologizing because this is a very uneven piece of paper. And so he's actually apologizing for the roughness of the paper. He doesn't have any more paper in the house. Running a tavern requires a lot of work. Um, it is not easy, even with local traffic through your tavern, local customers. There are meals to be served and inventory to be taken and drinks to be made and set up for different meetings and groups and so on, and cleaning and changing of sheets and keeping the Halstead family together. Um, Halstead married a second time to Anne Throckmorton, and they were married less than 6 years, and Anne died. And so now Halstead had two wives buried at Christ Church. Along with his infant Timothy, he lost another daughter in 1760, and that was the same year that Anne Throckmorton Halstead died. So bad luck seemed to follow Halstead more and more often. We don't know specifically if Halstead owned slaves. There's an indication that he may have, but we're not sure. We do know that he relied on the labor of indentured servants, at least two. One, a young man named Johann Meyer, who was a German indentured servant, and another man from England named Edward May. And we know this because both these men ran away, one in 1756 and the other in 1763. The advertisements are fascinating, as they so often are. And so we learn from the one on the left, Johann Meyer. Now, Jeremiah is not necessarily a German name. So is this a name that Johann was given because people had trouble pronouncing Johann? Was this? We don't know. He was about as tall as I am, 5'4", a little pitted with the smallpox, speaks very broken English, and he's about 21. And he ran away with a number of different types of clothing, and Halstead really wants him back. He is offering 40 shillings and £3 reward if Maya is taken outside of the county. This is an open-ended story. We have no idea if Maya was ever found. Then in 1763, Edward May runs away, and he's again 5'4", a bricklayer, a very swift workman, and he also had smallpox. I love this ad particularly because I love historic clothing, and the gray coat that Edward May ran away with had glass buttons, which was quite interesting. And he supposedly went off with a Samuel Leonard, who apparently supplied May with money in order to escape. So again, another open-ended story. We don't know if Halstead ever saw Edward May again, but it's also interesting that Halstead was relying on indentured servants for a lot of the labor required to run the tavern. 1765 comes around and Halstead realizes he has to face the writing on the wall. There's nothing quite like that feeling in the pit of your stomach. I wonder how many 3 o'clock in the mornings Halstead had, wondering how he was going to get out from under all of this debt. He knew he was in trouble. 11 years after he opened the Blue Ball with so much success, he was absolutely drowning. And his property sounds so beautiful. In complete order for a tavern, 56 acres of very good land and meadow, a good dwelling house. Well, that's the Allen house right there. Gardens, an orchard of excellent fruit, stables and other outhouses, all in good repair. And he's kind of bragging and boasting, it being the place where the most noted one in Shrewsbury hath been kept for many years. And he's trying to describe the fact that it doesn't have to be a tavern, it can be a store, good for a tradesman or any other public business. He also had a separate tract of land, a woodland, about 100 acres, lying a small distance. And he's willing to sell them together or separately. That's something that's very interesting. A lot of farmers and businessmen owned separate woodlots because you needed trees for firewood. And so if you had your own woodlot, then you could cut trees and gather lumber and wood for your fireplace as you needed. And then he's also talking about a third piece of property, 9 acres of very good land and meadow. And that also has a house, garden, and orchard. And it's so desperate. He's desperate to sell this. And there were absolutely no takers. I cannot stress how awful being a debtor was in colonial America. The debtor laws that regulated being placed in debtor's prison, having your property sold, these had deep roots as far back as medieval times. This was one of the few times where you could be arrested and your property seized virtually on the word of a creditor alone. You there really wasn't a trial for this. You were seized and placed into debtor's prison. And Halstead knew that the end was coming. And by 1770, this man who had been so successful and so admired in the community, his name was now on the list of town debtors. He couldn't pay his excise tax. And there was a real shame at this time in history to being a debtor. A lot of people considered it that you somehow had a moral failing or a moral weakness or something, that this happened to you for a reason, that somehow you deserved this. And that persisted well into the 19th century. For those of you who know who Michael Williams is, early American portrait artist, Williams was also in debtor's prison and went through the same thing. And this was almost 40 to 50 years after Halstead's own experience, and Williams experienced the same thing. Things virtually did not change for more than a half century. And it's interesting because Halstead's brothers, Timothy and Daniel, start showing up on the list of town debtors. And we don't know if that's because they were attempting to help Josiah and they ended up in financial distress, or what the story was. By 1772, Halstead was in debtor's prison, and he had to watch his tavern and all his property being sold out from under him. And a very terse newspaper article appeared in 1773, talked about the fact that Halstead was discharged from his confinement by an insolvent act, and his estate assigned to Joseph Leonard and John Longstreet for the use of his creditors. And this is therefore to desire all his creditors to meet at the house of the said Halstead in Shrewsbury the 10th day of April next, to give orders to the said assignees how to dispose of Josiah Halstead's estate. So what they're going to do is they're going to auction it off publicly. And Halstead had no say whatsoever in it. It was just devastating. And the house was sold out from under him, and he had nothing. In order to be released from debtor's prison, you actually ended up with the clothes on your back and about $10 worth of the tools of your trade, and that was it. Good luck. So the house was put up for auction, and the next Halstead tried to rent it back. He kind of fades into the background. We think he died in about 1781. He does appear in tax ratables for Shrewsbury with no property, no livestock, no nothing. So he lived the last years of his life completely in poverty. So the next person to own the Allen House was a gentleman named Stephen Tallman. He's quite a character. I don't think I would want this gentleman for my next door neighbor. He was described as being an ill-designing and disorderly person of a wicked and malicious mind. I don't like him already. He shows up again and again in the local courts. In 1761, for example, he was fined £5 for being the father of Mary Sickles' out of wedlock infant. 2 years later, he buys Halstead Tavern. He also, during the American Revolution, tried to play both sides of the fence with both British and forces for independence. And he was charged for selling Indian corn and flour to the British. One favorite, very interesting little incident happened when a woman happened to be cutting across his orchards, possibly ones connected to the Allen house, in order to get from one place to another. And he said he saw the woman pick an apple from his tree, and he was so angry that he shot at her. Now, supposedly, he was shooting at the limb above her head to scare her. But I don't know because it says with expert aim. I don't know, but she was very lucky that it didn't get any worse. And the house also has an amazing story connected to the American Revolution. By this time, 1779, Tallman had sold the house, this time to someone named Robert Bown, another Shrewsbury resident, and he owned the house during 1779. I believe it was in the summer. A small band of Continental soldiers from a Virginia unit were placed to watch the Shrewsbury residents, and they stationed themselves at Halstead's Tavern. It was a great place because it was centrally located, and what they were really doing was trying to get a grip on the movements of British raiders and refugees and loyalists. Well, a gentleman named Joseph Price found out that they were there. And Joseph Price worked as a raider, sort of like a soldier for hire, kind of a guerrilla warfare person. And he kind of hid in the shrubbery and watched until he felt the coast was clear. And then Price, with a few men, we're not quite sure how many, perhaps 10, perhaps 15, broke into the tavern. Unfortunately, the soldiers were upstairs and they had left their muskets downstairs. And as the story goes, two men who hit the ground first at the bottom of the stairs were bayoneted, bled on the floor, and were dragged outside to die. And then the rest were captured. And apparently, the blood stains stayed on the floor for years afterwards. And Joseph Price actually told this story to a relative who wrote it down and then many years later passed it on to Reverend McLean of Freehold, who was gathering in the mid 19th century all of these Revolutionary War stories. Well, what's really interesting is that Joseph Price was incredibly familiar with the layout of the tavern. His wife, Abigail, was Abigail Halstead. She was one of Josiah Halstead's daughters. So Price had been in and out of the tavern any number of times. So the tavern men, they might as well have just put a revolving door on the tavern, because then it changed hands a number of times until it ended up with two brothers, the White boys, Benjamin and Robert. And they kept trying to make a go of it. And virtually every year there was a new person there renting it to make a tavern. And finally, Benjamin had had enough. And in a reminiscence, he talked about the corner house we rented for a tavern to a man named Joseph Vonk. And so I can imagine Benjamin wandering by, and the house was on fire several times. And at one point, he drove by and the house was on fire, and he was able to obtain help, get the fire put out, and that was it. He was done with it. The White boys didn't want anything more to do with it. And so that's where our next owner, Dr. Edmund William Allen, comes in. And he bought the house in 1814. And that's the time when the house stopped being a tavern and would never be a tavern again. And instead, for the next 40 some odd years, it would be a doctor's office and a family home. Edmund Allen was born in Shrewsbury. He was well aware of the Blue Ball Tavern, and I think he always had his eye on it. He talked about really liking the house and admiring it. And after he got his medical license from Philadelphia, He married a local girl, Sarah Throckmorton, and they bought the house and revised it to make it a family home and a medical office and a small pharmacy. And they moved in and started their family. And the information about 19th century medicine and medical practices is very interesting. It's quite fascinating to imagine Alan performing minor surgery and all the kinds of interesting and fascinating medical practices and procedures that you could expect if you were going to the doctor in mid 19th century Shrewsbury. You can see here on the top left, here's Edmund marrying Sarah Throckmorton, June 16th, 1814. So that was a red letter year for the Allens. He bought the house and married the same year. And he was very successful. He had office hours, but on the top right is the 1850 census. And at the bottom, so there at the top is Dr. Allen, physician, and the real estate is valued at $6,000. And there's his wife, Sarah, and then their children, their three daughters, Elizabeth, Sarah, and Harriet, and their one son, Edward, pardon me, and then two servants. One is a young woman named Ellen, and then there's Joseph Emmanuel, and he's African American, and he's described as a live-in hostler. Well, a hostler is somebody who takes care of wagons, carriages, horses. He would have been on call 24/7 anytime Alan had to go out on a medical call. So it would be Joseph's responsibility to hitch up the horse for the wagon or the carriage or buggy. So Dr. Allen could make his rounds. And also if there was a, like a midnight emergency or something locally, Joseph would have to get up and hitch up the horses and possibly do the driving as well. So here are some daguerreotypes and photographs from our own collection. We love the Allens because they were the type of family to save everything, very much like the Taylor family of Marlpit Hall. And there's Sarah in her old age with that beautiful white cap and her spectacles. And then we have two images of two of the girls. We don't have an image of Elizabeth, but there's daughter Harriet on the top, and then Edmund at the top right, and Sarah at the lower right. And the two quilt squares were made by one made by Harriet and the other made by Sarah. They were absolutely maniacal quilt makers. And we have several quilts that were made by the Allen girls, and two of them are going to be on view in our upcoming quilt exhibition at the Taylor Butler House. And that's going to be open starting weekend in Old Monmouth. So if you want more about the Allens, you can come up to Taylor Butler House and see their quilt. And as busy and bustling and happy as the Allen house, Allen family might have been, there was still kind of a dark side to the household. And it's contained in this one ad. And this is an advertisement for a runaway named Rose Potter, a 15-year-old girl. And she was, quote unquote, a servant in the Allen family household. By this time, 1836, the manumission laws had kicked in, so Rose could expect to work for the Allens until she was about 21. And then by law, she was supposed to be given her freedom. But based on this ad, I don't know how happy her life in the household was. If you read, for example, the thumb of her left hand was deformed by what was called a felon. And this is an infection, a bacterial infection that gets in through a wound and works its way under the membrane that coats the bone. And it usually affects fingers, very often thumbs. And if it's not treated with antibiotics, it really gets in there and there's really no way to get it out. And what it does is start to break down the bone, and the bone will splinter and work its way out piece by piece. It's incredibly painful, incredibly painful. And remember, this is 90 years before the very first antibiotics would be introduced. So this was something that Rose was really suffering from. This wasn't just a little cut. This was something that was really very painful and chronic. And it was very disfiguring too. It was not attractive. And then for some reason, her hair very short, having been cut the day previous to her leaving. Why was her hair very short? Who cut it? What was the circumstance? The ad almost seems to indicate that this was sort of the last straw, and it might have been what caused Rose to finally pick up and go. So we don't know, again, open-ended story. We have no idea what happened to Rose, if she escaped, if she was brought back, what happened to her. Um, so that, again, another unknown ending to the story, but it does point to sort of a much more unpleasant part of the Allen family household. And here is probably what we think the oldest current identified picture of the Allen house. When Dr. Allen died in 1867, his son Edmund built this addition on the east side of the building as a use for a store. And local man Harry Borden took it over and ran a dry goods and pretty much a grocery store out of it for many, many years. But here you can see it still has its original scalloped shingles on it. You see the original dormers there. You can see the big chimney on the west side of the house. And once again, it's had a picket fence around it for almost its entire existence. I cannot look at this picture without shivering. On, believe it or not, today, April 17th in 1914. So this is the anniversary of it. Um, the house caught fire. The origin of the fire was unknown, but you can see the damage it's done to the house. It affected, fortunately, the later wing most, but it did do some serious damage to the roof of the original structure. And so the photograph appeared in the newspaper, and people were outraged and dismayed by the damage. So there were a lot of follow-up newspaper articles talking about how the Allen family and Mr. Borden really took care of it, and they tried to use real beams, 18th century beams. There were descriptions in the newspaper of colonial barn beams being incorporated into the repairs. And interestingly enough, for the exterior work later this year and next year, we will be removing a good portion of the shingles on the roof. So it'll be very interesting to see if we can track some of that repair work. And so this is a great image here. You can see the scaffolding up top and how beautifully they've restored the roof line. You can see the burn marks and the scarring on the side of the building, but they did in fact repair and rebuild the addition as well. And let's see. So the house remained in the Allen family for more than a century. And so after Dr. Allen's death, Sarah Allen continued to live in it. After her death, it went to the unmarried girls, Harriet and Sarah. And then it ended up going to a couple of nieces. And then in, let's see, 1927, Maggie Allen sold the house to George Silver, who was at one point mayor of Shrewsbury. And so Mr. Silver bought the house, thank goodness, because he was desperately afraid that the house was going to be demolished. And so by purchasing it, he was attempting to save it, which he did. So throughout its history, it's had people who have watched out for it and really taken care of it. So thank you, Mayor Silver. The house was rented out again and served a lot of different purposes. During the Great Depression, it was the Colonial Tea Room, and then it was the Blue Door Tea Room. And then for about 2 years, it was a small antique shop. And at one point during the Depression, it was actually considered as a possible location for the Shrewsbury Municipal Hall. And they put it to a vote, and it was defeated by a 2-to-1 public referendum. And then in 1937, the house as it existed at that time was captured through drawings and descriptions and photographs. And the Historic American Building Survey is fascinating. You could go down a rabbit hole with this, but during the Depression, President Roosevelt was desperate to put everybody he could back to work, including architects, draftsmen, and photographers. And so the HABS was put together, we call it HABS, and they went around really with the focus of documenting the earliest buildings in colonial America. So they were going up to Massachusetts and to New Jersey, New York, all the states. And Allen House was one of them. So we have some amazing documentary photographs. And this one is fascinating. You can see some of the additions. There's now a big chimney. The much larger addition is now a much smaller addition, sort of like a two kind of step addition there. But there's the smaller kitchen wing on the left side of the house, and the dormers are still on the third floor on the roof. And I encourage anybody who's interested in historic architecture, the Library of Congress has digitized the entire Historic American Building Survey archives. And so all the photographs, depending on where you come from, you can plug in what you're interested in and it will come up. Many sites in Monmouth County were surveyed, including surviving buildings at Alair and North American Phalanx and Marl Pit Hall and Covenhoven House. It's just amazing to see, and a lot of the buildings do not exist anymore. So it's a lot of fun to, and kind of bittersweet to go through a lot of those records. And here's the back of the house. Again, very rare image. And so you can see this second floor, this two-story addition on the back. That's no longer there. And then you have the kitchen wing. And then to the right of the kitchen wing is another wing. And that looks like it's sort of mid-19th century, perhaps. And you have the staircase, what that looked like in 1937. And then they also did very detailed floor plans, cellar, first, second, and third floors. So a lot of really fantastic documentary evidence for the restoration project. And they even took a picture of the smokehouse. This smokehouse was restored about 12, 15 years ago by the very generous Monmouth County Historical Commission. And so many of these old houses do not retain their outbuildings, but a structure like the Allen House, particularly when it was a tavern, would have had all sorts of outbuildings, barns, stables, workshops, sheds, smokehouses, you name it. And this is the only one still surviving. So it's one of the handful of smokehouses still standing in Monmouth County. And if that weren't enough, there was another fire. This poor house in 1942 on March 10th, there was another fire. This one not quite as serious, thank goodness. And they didn't know whether it was an electrical fire or apparently the chimney was still working. The fireplace was still being used and it might have been a spark from the chimney. But you can see some of the damage, the dark spots, the dark shadow on the roof and the broken glass. And so it was replaced once again. And so we know we have some work to do because they didn't do quite as detailed a job this time around as they did in 1914. And the roof has developed a bit of a sway back. So that's one of the things we'll be doing with the exterior restoration. So the house passed through one or two more hands, and then it was bought by Mrs. Holmes in the early 1940s. And she only lived there a few years before her death. And at her death in 1948, two things became known. The first is that she left life rights of the house to a close family friend, Miss Lily Hulson, and you see her here on the left. And the second thing was that once Miss Hulson decided not to live in the house anymore, it was going to go to the Monmouth County Historical Association. So in 1948, we had Marl Pit Hall. We had not purchased Holmes Hendrickson House yet. So we knew that this house was coming to us. And Miss Hulson lived in the house until 1961. And then she moved into a nursing home, and the newspapers were there when she handed over the front door key to board president, Mrs. Bayard Stout. And at that point, we now had Marl Pit Hall, Holmes Hendrickson house, which we purchased for $1 in 1959. And at virtually the exact same time, we bought Covenhoven House. So the historical association went from 2 houses to 4. That's a lot of houses to take care of. And I love this image of the Allen House because the TV antenna looming up over the roof line is really one of my favorite little images. I think that's quite funny. And so this very small organization with a very devoted and energetic board realized they had their work cut out for them. Covenhoven kind of took center stage. Allen House was kind of in a holding pattern for a while, and a lot of work really didn't begin until after 1970. So the Historical Association decided to focus on the Covenhoven House first because that actually needed less work. And the same mindset went with both buildings. So the bicentennial was looming, and both of these houses were important colonial American Revolution sites. And so the decision was made to basically take everything off that was felt not to be 18th century and make it as 18th century as possible. We would not do that nowadays. Historical preservation architecture has really changed in a philosophical way. And by taking off some of these later editions, you're really removing chapters of the house, the story of the house. So it was a much different time period then. But both houses were finally restored in time for the bicentennial. And here are just some of the images. I love the one at the far right. Here are the shingles, which have been scraped. A number of the original shingles, at least from the mid to late 18th century, were still on the house at that time, but virtually all of them were replaced because a lot of them had so degraded and they were almost paper thin. So virtually all the shingles you see on the house now are replacements. And fortunately, some of the documentary photographs that were taken reveal some early construction details that are fascinating. So at the far left and far right, you see what's called noggin, and that's interior insulation, which is mud and brick and straw and horsehair. And the straw and the horsehair hold the mud together for insulation. And it must work well because what you're seeing, particularly on the right, that's very early. You're looking at something that might have been there as early as Richard Stillwell's ownership. And then the top center picture, that's the fireplace in the old kitchen with the stairs wrapping around the left up to the kitchen loft. And then at the bottom center are some of the big beams near the milkroom cellar. And you can see some of the notches and how that section of the house has been reworked not once, but multiple times. And so this is what the Allen House looked like in the early 1970s, probably around 1972 or so in the winter. And so you see the sign out front, and there's a brand new roof on it, and the shingles are now all prepped and ready to be painted. And you can see the raw wood of the new front door. And they did a good job, I think. The fence looks a little ragged, but they fixed that too. And it was it was really a 9 days wonder. The articles in local newspapers, not just in Monmouth County, but throughout the state, talking about the restoration of this amazing building. At the time, they kept saying that it was as early as 1667, and that's how old it was. Because of course, dendrochronology was in its infancy, so they really didn't have a way to test it. But it made for a good story anyway, and there certainly had been a structure on the site, either on the foundations or nearby as the early, so that wasn't too far a stretch. And I love the image of the three photographs. So here's one on the left, and that one is probably around 1880, 1890, and then the house in the 1930s, and then the brand new restored Allen House ready to open up on September 29th, 1974. And they did a lot of work inside too, because they determined, the association at that time determined that they were going to make Covenhoven and Allen House fully furnished. And the collection at that time couldn't stretch quite that far. So Marshall Blankarn, one of the board members at that time, was very generous, and among much else, I believe, purchased probably every 18th century green glass liquor bottle in a tri-state area in order to furnish Allen House as a tavern. And here are some other board members. That's Linda King on the left and Mary Lou Strong on the right. And they're posing as barmaids for a publicity shot. And here's the meeting room with some of the additional furniture, with a beautiful pineapple welcoming brand new visitors to the Allen House. And so publicity photographs were taken after everything was fully furnished. And this is just an amazing image, that tin 12 light sconce hanging from the ceiling will go back. That's been there since 1974, and we plan to put that back when the restoration is finished. But they really pulled out all the stops, and to have a space that had been used as a public meeting gathering, a community space, was just really so amazing. And visitorship was through the roof for several years after it opened. And I love this newspaper article. It calls the Allen House the area's history hub. And it really has been the center of history for 315 years at this intersection. And we're just really excited to get going with the active part of the conservation and restoration of the building. And this beautiful painting here by Conrad Newman, a local artist, was given to the Historical Association. And that was painted in 1972, before all the work was finished. And that was his concept of how the house was going to look when it was done. And other than the fact that it was decided that it was going to be painted red, Newman really hit the nail on the head. The house looks virtually identical, and I love how he also included the smokehouse. And so the work is going to begin. We're working with the historic preservation architect. Funding has been incredibly generous, and I really have to give a big shout out to a lot of the funders. The entire project, we're on part 3 of a multi-stage project, and it's all been funded by the New Jersey Historic Trust. So anybody thinking about, their taxes and so on, well, this is one of the good things that your tax money does. The Historic Trust deems different properties worthy of preservation. And when they sign on to support a project, the trust is going to support it all the way. And so they're going to fund the exterior. We've gotten that grant. They gave us $200,000, and that's a 1-to-1 match. And we've gotten the second part of that match. And part of it is through generosity from Circle Auto Group and also from Stillwell Hanson. And it's never enough. So we also will put up a link. I encourage anyone who wants to participate in making sure that this amazing structure that still speaks, that still has so many stories to tell, and that's been the site of so much joy and heartache and drama, can stand there for another 300 years. This thing was built to last. And by this restoration, we're ensuring its successful survival, hopefully for another 300 years. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bernadette. Hold on, I'm gonna put up a QR code. Let's see. Tell me if you can see it. Can you see you?
I
Here
see
we go.
me.
Can you
There
see
it is
that?
with the little dinosaur. Yes, that's Josiah, the T-Rex
The
QR code.
T-Rex. Yes, we custom made that. Okay, so we can open it up to questions if you guys would like. We still have
I love
180 people
questions.
on, so I'm sure there's some questions to be had.
Yes, because I that means everybody was paying attention and nobody fell asleep. So
Okay, so someone's asking, were the Patriot soldiers who were captured at the Allen House the same who had fired on the British on top of Christchurch?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I don't know. Shrewsbury was an absolute hotbed. And because it was so close to the coast, you had a lot of loyalists, you had a lot of raiders, you had a lot of continentals. It really was a civil war. It wasn't just the colonies against Great Britain, it was neighbor against neighbor.
Yeah.
So it's possible, but we don't know for sure.
Okay. Someone is asking, they said in grade school, they heard a story that George Washington sat in a chair there. Is that true?
Um, as far as our research goes, no. I wouldn't be surprised that George Washington rode by it at least once, but we don't know for sure. I think if he had, we would have known that. There are a lot of very interesting kind of history-ish uh, stories connected with the Allen House. One of them I heard was that there was a secret tunnel from the Allen House to Christ Church. I don't know why you would want a secret tunnel from a tavern to a house of worship.
Mm.
And that's never been proven. There's never really been any information or ground penetrating radar that has proven that there was ever a tunnel. And then there was another story in a news early 20th century newspaper that was kind of garbled, and I think it kind of confused the massacre with something else. But there was supposedly the bones of a Patriot soldier found behind the second floor paneling. Um, I've never found any confirmation of that. And we have peeked behind the paneling and there weren't any bones. So I think
No,
that was kind of, yeah, I think it
you're
was
sure.
kind of possibly, I don't know. If there is, we'll have another presentation about the bones.
Yes,
That would
we
be
will.
amazing. But as far as I know, no, no bones.
Okay. Someone is asking if it will be open for weekend in Old Monmouth. No.
No, it will not because it is now an active restoration site. So we do have some of the walls and ceilings opened up, and the house is completely cleared out. However, anybody is welcome to drive in and park. The herb garden looks just as beautiful, if not more so than ever, through the beautiful creativity and dedication of the Shrewsbury Garden Club. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. If you're there listening, we always appreciate it. It's just beautiful.
Yeah, it really is.
And we do have a fantastic audio tour as well. If you haven't had enough of hearing my voice, you can use the QR code on our website and access that. And so you can walk around the exterior and learn a little bit more about the house. And
Mhm.
it's also just a nice place to sit and enjoy the view.
We have a paranormal buff, and he's asking if there are any ghosts in.
Lovely. That is a good question. I personally am not sensitive, although all of our houses have very distinct personalities. But there have been any number of individuals who have sensed presences, and we've had several paranormal groups investigating the Allen House. We did have the ghost tours for 2 years. I'm looking forward to when the Allen House reopens and we can start up our ghost tours there again. It was always a very popular sold out event. Um, so I don't know. There are stories. Let's see. I think there's one story about people driving by swearing they've seen a woman in a rocking chair in one of the windows at night. So I don't know. So
That's a
when you
big.
drive by it, if the traffic isn't too busy, glance up and see if you see her. I'm not sure. She could be one of the Allen sisters. We don't know.
Mhm. Have there been any excavations at the outhouse or any treasures found there?
Yes, actually, we have. That's a good question. There's been digging off and on since the 70s. In 1972, director at that time, Charlie Lyle, ran a um, small but really productive dig, and the people working with him were actually board members, including Judy Stanley and Mary Lou Strong. And they were digging and came up with some very interesting things. And then we had an archaeology. Oh, look, there's the staff. We
Yeah, an
had the archaeology. That's a nice one. We had the archaeology camp there in the mid 90s. And my favorite single find was a small shard of ceramic, and it was exactly identical to one of the ceramic mugs that we had on one of the tavern tables. So there are middens and trash pits all over the property. We think that there might be some interesting finds more towards the front of the property, but we're really hesitant to dig there on the north and south sides of the property because you never know when another car is going to take it a little too fast through the intersection again and plow through the fence.
Someone would like to know if we're going to be replacing the fence that was painted by the DAR.
Um, no, we're always going to have a picket fence,
Mhm.
and the DAR did a beautiful job. Um, the first time I came across a reference to a car driving through the fence was in 1975. Before then, I don't know how many times. I imagine, like Josiah Halstead coming out one day and noticing that a wagon had plowed through the fence. I wouldn't be surprised. It's a very busy and dangerous intersection. I don't think we're going to wholesale replace it. It's very expensive. But we definitely plan on maintaining a picket fence there because there's been a picket fence there since at least 1800.
And also, one more thing, just want to make sure that everybody knows that we're still having the 4th of July at the Allen House this year.
Oh,
So,
yes,
same kind of
that's right.
thing, definitely come and you could be there. You could be on that historic property and listen to the audio tour. So, just
And
wanted to.
the reason we hold the Fourth of July reading of the Declaration there is because that was one of the earliest places in the area that the Declaration was read publicly was the Allen House. And I will mention, I think Josiah Halstead would be amazed that we still mention his name, but for I would have to say at least 40 years after his death, in the newspapers and documents, the house was still referred to as Halstead's Tavern or the old tavern once known as the Blue Ball. So even after death, Halstead was still recognized as the owner.
All right. And it looks like that's it. That's all we have time for.
Thank you
So,
so much, everybody.
thank you, Bernadette. That was wonderful.
And if anybody has any more questions, you can always email us, and we're always happy to answer.
Mhm.
Um, and for those of you who want more, we plan to, once the work really gets underway, we plan to post regularly short videos and blog about it. Because I have a feeling we're going to find some pretty interesting discoveries during the construction phase.
Hopefully. All right. Have a good night.
Okay, thanks,
Good night,
everybody.
everyone.
Good night.
Bye.